A parcel has arrived. Let's open this one up and see what we got inside. So this is a book I bought from a seller on Etsy, and it's a vintage cookbook. The Gayelord Hauser Cookbook. Good food, good health, good looks. So Gayelord Hauser was a German chap born as Helmut Eugen Benjamin Gellert Hauser in Germany in 1895, and he moved to America in the early part of the 20th century. He had a remarkable recovery from tuberculosis in the era before antibiotics as a result of unconventional treatments. And he went on promoting a lifestyle based on a handful of different, what he called wonder foods, that he believed would transform people's lives. He was widely criticized as being a food faddist and a quack, but on the other hand, he lived in remarkably good health until the age of 89. So, maybe he was onto something. A lot of what he was about was just whole foods anyway, actually. It was things like wheat germ and rejection of highly processed foods. So maybe there was some interesting stuff in what he wrote. I don't know why he changed his name from Gellert to Gayelord. Maybe that was just to try to de-Germanize his name or something like that. He was living in the United States during both world wars, although he didn't change his surname. I have no idea why he changed his name from Gellert to Gayelord. It's a variant of the same name anyway. But so, let's read the preface. Tender meat, deliciously grilled, bright-coloured fresh vegetables, plump and succulent with their own juices, crisp salads, aromatic with herbs, nut-like breads made from freshly ground whole flour. What cook does not aspire to serve such meals? Okay, well, here's what I'm going to do. I am going to read this book cover to cover, and I'll review it. And, we'll see what's in here. But just before we start, let's just have a skim through. So, short cooking vegetables. The greatest loss of vitamins occurs between the time when the food is put on the fire and the time when it reaches the boiling point. Therefore, have your cooking pot, one small enough so your vegetables will fill it to the top, piping hot before the food's put in. It seems like a reasonable thing to say. I mean, not everybody cooks vegetables that way, and not all vegetables the same way. But yeah, so he's talking here about not cooking vegetables too long in order to preserve their nutrition. That doesn't seem an unreasonable thing to be saying. You're talking about variety, eating variety. Again, I don't see a problem with that. That actually seems like a sensible thing to do. You can achieve complete nutrition by either carefully designing your diet so that it has all the right things in it, or just by making sure you eat a variety of things. Okay, well, anyway, as I say, I'm going to go off and read this book, and I'll pick a recipe from here, maybe 2 recipes, and we'll give it a try, and we'll see what it tastes like. So I've now read this book cover to cover, and I've made some notes, and I think generally it's not a bad book, and generally a lot of the advice in here is relatively obvious, at least by a modern lens. It's significantly about whole foods. It's also got a significant lean towards not destroying nutrients by overcooking things or boiling things and throwing away all the nutrients that come out in the water. So there are some good ideas in here. There are also 1 or 2 weird ideas in here, which we'll get to in a minute. So to start with, there's some interesting stuff in here. As I say, a lot of it's about whole foods. He's got a thing about not eating refined foods, which is great. So he's talking about refined white flour being a foodless food, which is, by modern standards, that we're getting to know that refined foods aren't that great for you. And wholemeal flour, obviously, wholemeal wheat flour is better than white flour in general. But he extends this to brown sugar. And so he's completely okay with brown sugar, doesn't like white sugar, but completely okay with brown sugar. And also makes some really dogmatic assertions, which he just doesn't explain. So, for example, here it says, of course, fresh pork and lard have no place in a healthful regime. No explanation, just, pork is bad. I thought that might have been a religious dietary influence here, but it turns out that it's not, because although he says pork and lard have no place in a healthful regime, he thinks bacon's great. I mean, I agree. But yeah, so in the next section, which is salads and fruit, again, he's promoting the consumption of a very wide and varied diet, which is a good way of making sure you do get all the nutrients. I would say he possibly overstates the importance of something called Hauser broth. This is his kind of one of his things, Hauser broth, which is that he makes this liquid. Well, there's a recipe for it. And we'll come back to this page in a minute, but Hauser broth, so you take carrots, celery, spinach, parsley, onion, celery root, and salt and water, and you just simmer that for, I think, only about half an hour. And then you drain off the liquid, and you use that liquid to cook vegetables, or you just drink it, or whatever. And this is one of his kind of miracle foods. And sure, it's vegetable water. It's probably not bad, but I imagine it's probably not quite so miraculous as he might claim. Now, one thing he is really hot on is this alkaline diet thing. So he mentions this in quite a few places. Gayelord Hauser was a believer in the alkaline diet theory, which is a piece of dietary pseudoscience.
Okay, editing shrimp here. Just a quick side note. Skip it if you wish, but I feel it's probably worth saying a few additional words about this alkaline diet thing. It is pseudoscience, and here's why. In a nutshell, the hypothesis is that certain foods leave residual ash in your bloodstream, by which they mean a variety of soluble chemicals, and this may be acidic or alkaline, causing the pH of your blood to change, and in the case of acid ash, this pH change is argued to cause all sorts of health problems. Therefore, according to the regime, you're supposed to consume more of the foods that supposedly create alkaline ash and try to balance your blood pH on the alkaline side of neutral. We'll come back to blood pH in a moment. The only problem is that in the 112 years since this hypothesis was first proposed, no compelling evidence has been found to support the existence of this acid or alkaline ash, and such evidence shouldn't be hard to find if it was there. It's talking about the presence of various specific chemicals in the bloodstream. If they were there, we should have found them by now. Instead, as a result of extensive and repeated searching and not finding, it becomes a lot more compelling an argument to say that they're probably not there. Furthermore, side note to a side note, if the pH of your blood changes very much from its normal level, you are about to have a really bad day. Blood pH is just not something that fluctuates very much at all. And if and when it actually does, you're probably in immediate danger in a way that requires prompt medical intervention, not just a little diet tweak. Now, some people might argue, but it works for some people, so it must be true. Well, yes, but also no. Following the proposed diet does indeed seem to improve the health of some people. Let's take a look at the broad strokes of the diet and see if we can guess why. It comprises essentially eat lots of fruits and vegetables, eat nuts, legumes, seeds, avoid highly processed or refined foods, keep hydrated with water or herbal teas, reduce your intake of meat, alcohol and caffeine. So for a lot of people in the developed world, who might be eating a lot of junk food or snacks or takeaways or pre-prepared meals, this obviously just represents a move in a direction toward a healthier and more balanced diet than they were currently consuming, especially if they have to procure and cook the ingredients themselves and be mindful about what they're putting into their food. It is not remarkable in the slightest that this would work to improve the health of a lot of people. So the alkaline diet works, sort of, but for none of the causative reasons it's argued to work. It works by accident. And yet that cause is still being actively argued. That, specifically, is what makes it pseudoscientific. In actual real science, when your hypothesis is contradicted by evidence, or if, in this case, after a whole century of searching, no compelling evidence is turning up, you're supposed to modify your hypothesis or scrap it altogether and try a brand new one. Then go back to looking at evidence. Not doggedly and hopefully cling to it as though it might still somehow come true one day. And this matters because whilst the high-level summary of the alkaline diet looks pretty good and balanced and sensible, the detail prescribes avoiding or unnecessarily reducing some things that are probably pretty good for you. Anyway, sidetrack over, back now to book review shrimp.
And then there's quite a lot of kind of recipe bits themed by meats, eggs, cheese, meat substitutes, so a lot of vegetarian recipes in here. Not vegan, but vegetarian, sort of ovo-lacto vegetarian. Sauces, he's rather dismissive of the whole of French sauce cookery here in quite a rude way, actually. I'll just read this bit to you. It's almost impossible for me to talk about sauces without saying something about the French. They're justly famous for their imagination in blending flavours, and you cannot go too far in emulating them. But there's another side to the picture. The whole philosophy of cooking in France is based on two things which do not apply to us. First, their cookery presupposes that a woman spends her whole time in the kitchen. Does it? I didn't think it did. Second, the masses of the French people have never had the opportunities we have to get really first-class foods at prices within their range. For that reason, many of the French sauces are designed to disguise second-rate ingredients. But to us, good eating is based on foods of the first quality, and our sauces merely enhance the flavour. I think that's a little bit dismissive, actually, of French sauce cookery. I don't think that's necessarily the reason why French sauces exist. He's saying this because he doesn't like white flour. And a couple of the French mother sauces are a roux-based sauce, so they use white flour and butter for their thickening. And I think that's why he's just found a reason to be dismissive about the French sauce cookery. He's fine with hollandaise. He goes on to say he likes hollandaise, but he's not fond of the flour thickened sauces, and so he had to go and badmouth the French. I don't think it's necessarily true that the French only had access to second-rate ingredients. I've only travelled to France within my lifetime, but that doesn't ring true for me. I don't know if it did, maybe historically. So moving on, let's talk about a few of the other weird things. So there's lots and lots of fairly wholesome recipes. They are a little bit on the plain side, I would say, but that's perhaps just because they are of their time. But some of the strange stuff. So if we get to beverages, he's got this strange adherence to chewing law. So these diets where are we? Fletcherized foods. He pays tribute here to Horace Fletcher. Horace Fletcher was this chap who believed that we should chew every mouthful of food until it's a fine milky paste before it's swallowed. It is true that pulverizing some fruits and vegetables does make more of the nutrients in those things more readily available for us to absorb, but this whole Fletcherized foods thing just takes that idea to bizarre extreme. But also in this section he talks about liquidizing fruits and vegetables to extract the juice so that you can have the juice without the irritating bulk of the vegetables. That isn't really sound in terms of today's insight into what the stuff in vegetables is about. It's better to eat vegetables and fruits than it is to drink their juices, just because juicing inevitably removes some of the fibre from the vegetables, and fibre in your diet is generally a good thing to have. He returns again later here somewhere to his adherence to the alkaline diet theory, and one of his miracle foods is blackstrap molasses, and I think that's why he's got this kind of acceptance of brown sugar, because there are two different sorts of brown sugar, by the way. There's brown sugar, which is made by adding molasses to white sugar and stirring it in and coating the white sugar grains with molasses. But there's also unrefined cane sugar, which is brown in colour, and often people call that brown sugar. That used to be brown sugar. You can still get it, but that's naturally brown because the stuff that comes out in molasses when sugar is refined just isn't taken out on unrefined sugar. Anyway, back in the thing about juices, there's a really, really strange thing here. So mixed vegetable juices are good, but the fruit juices are better taken one at a time. Lemon juice and orange juice neutralize each other, so you do not get the full benefit of either. Don't think that's true. I think that's just nonsense. Again, one of his dogmatic assertions, lemon juice and orange juice cancel each other out somehow, even though they're almost the same thing. So overview, it's mostly very healthy, whole food recipes, very straightforward and fairly simple recipes that you couldn't really criticize. They're probably a bit underspiced by some people's estimation. Just here and there, really weird dogmatic things. So here we go. When we get down to here, he's got all the different meats. And we come to bacon. And he said, yeah, here we are. Bacon is the only part of the pig permitted in health cookery. Doesn't bother to explain why he believes that. Just seems to think that we will accept it as given that pigs are not for eating. And again, it's not that he's Jewish or Muslim, because he does accept bacon, and elsewhere in here he's got recipes for shellfish and things like that as well, which would be forbidden if he was keeping kosher. So yeah, don't know why he does that, and he doesn't bother to explain. I mean, perhaps he explains in one of his other books. This is a cookbook, He did write diet theory books as well, so perhaps in those books he explains his rationale for these things and doesn't feel the need to reiterate those explanations here. So, rating this book, on the whole, there's a lot of very wholesome recipes in here, and most of what he says about whole foods, simply cooked, is pretty solid and sound. And if you can navigate around the weirdness where he's just a bit obsessive about his Hauser broth and a little bit too forgiving of the inclusion of sugar as long as it's brown sugar, if you can navigate around those things, there's actually a lot of good stuff in here. So that's the overview of this book. What I've done is just gone through here and selected some things that I maybe want to talk about, maybe recipes that I want to try. Obviously, I'm not going to make every recipe in this book. I'm not probably going to make more than a couple of recipes out of this book, or else this video will never see the light of day. So I just picked out a few things that are interesting to talk about. So the first one is this Hauser broth. I'm not going to make this because it's really an ingredient that you then use for other things. But it's a cup of shredded carrots, a cup of shredded celery, half a cup of shredded spinach, a tablespoon of chopped parsley, a large onion chopped, a whole of a large celery root, so a whole celeriac chopped, a heaped teaspoon of veggie salt, and a quart of water. That's about a litre, I think. So you put these vegetables in cold or warm water and bring to a simmer for 30 minutes. And you keep the juice and throw away the vegetables. Hauser had this perhaps slightly exaggerated emphasis on the notion that all of the goodness of food is in the liquid element of it. There is one other recipe in this book for vegetable loaf here, which uses the vegetable pulp from making Hauser broth, but that's the only recipe, as far as I can tell, in the book that actually uses those cooked vegetables for something else. Anyway, not going to make Hauser broth because really that means I'd have to do that and then make at least 2 other recipes. What else have we got though? Well, this was interesting. Veggie burgers. These are called veggie burgers because they're beef burgers that contain vegetables. So that bit of terminology there is going to be confusing because I think the modern usage of veggie burgers, we tend to think of them as something that doesn't contain meat. Okay, so yeah, vegetable loaf. What else have we got? Here's probably the strangest recipe in the whole book, which is wild rice and almond pudding. So this is in the cereals section, which follows after the milk desserts and the fruit desserts. And this is cereals in the sense of cooking grains, not breakfast cereals necessarily, but it is rather breakfast focused. So it's got muesli, various other things in there. But wild rice and almond pudding. Notionally, this is a dessert type of dish, or dessert breakfast type of dish, because it talks about serving it with an apple sauce or a lemon sauce, but it's a rice and vegetable pudding that contains onions and garlic and salt. So it's savoury dessert almost. It's got raisins, got crumbled shredded wheat as well. So I think I might make this. And then on the cakes, there were a few interesting cakes as well. So nutritious spice cake just sounds like a fairly decent whole meal based cake, or quick service cake. So I might make a cake as well. We'll see. It'll either be quick service cake or nutritious spice cake. But anyway, let's head to the kitchen now because I think we're going to make wild rice and almond pudding. We are today going to be trying to make this quick service cake. So really got a means of keeping recipe books in the kitchen. I don't normally take a book in the kitchen. Anyway, so we wanted half a cup of butter. Now it's all measured in cups and stuff, and I don't want to mess up my half cup measure by cramming butter in there. And because everything's typically measured by weight in this country, butter packs are not marked in cup measures, and we don't have sticks of butter, we just have blocks. Anyway, half a cup of butter, a cup of brown sugar. Now this is this unrefined sugar, so this is not brown sugar that's been made by adding molasses to white sugar. This is brown sugar that's brown because it's unrefined. This is sugar that Gayelord Hauser would have approved of. Right, I suppose that's about right. And then I have to cream these things together. So, I mean, this is old school cake mixing, where we just smoosh this together until it forms a paste. So let's cream them together until they're light and fluffy. Okay, I think that's as close as we're going to get to light and fluffy. Add the eggs. So 2 eggs, well beaten. Okay, it says add the eggs. It doesn't actually say to mix in the eggs, but I'm assuming, this being an old school cake mixture, that we are meant to combine the eggs, not just add them. Right, sift the flours with the dry ingredients. I think I'll do this in a different container. So we want 1 cup of sifted whole wheat flour. I'm just not used to working with cups, and so my whole setup is not geared around the notion of having to get a cup into something to be able to measure it out. So there we go, a cup of whole wheat flour. It doesn't say anything about packing it down, so I'm going to assume that we don't. Actually, what we'll do as well is add the other dry ingredients. A teaspoon of baking soda, 2 teaspoons of baking powder, a teaspoon of cinnamon, half a teaspoon of veggie salt. Now the closest thing I can get to veggie salt here is this stuff. This is a Swiss vegetable bouillon powder, half a teaspoonful. This does contain things like onions and garlic and whatnot, but veggie salt does as well. Veggie salt is kind of ground up dried vegetables mixed with salt. Okay, and we want a cup of sifted soya flour as well. I had trouble getting this soya flour, but there it is. It's about a cup. Weirdly lightweight stuff, this soy flour. It's not going through my sieve very well, and I think that's because it's being blocked up by the bran in the whole wheat flour. So I don't know if my wholemeal flour is perhaps not as finely ground as the one in the recipe, but I'm struggling to sieve this now because the sieve is just blocked up with the bran. We could try a coarser sieve. A lot of sifting flour advice comes from days when it was a lot more important to sieve your flour because there would be great big clumps and lumps and possibly foreign bodies in there. In the modern world, there isn't so much requirement or justification for needing to sieve your flour, although there are some lumps in there. Of course, I don't want to lose that bran, do I? So that's going to have to go in. I also need a cup of chopped mixed nuts, so I've put in about a cup and a bit in there because once they're chopped, they'll pack down more. This bit would hurt your ears unless I turn the audio down. That looks about right. So as I expected, about 1.25 cups of nuts has packed down to a full cup when it's chopped. So I will make a somewhat similar assumption with dates. We're going to need a bit more than a cupful. Well, that was not effective at all. I'm going to have to chop those by hand, I think. Yeah, some things in that food processor just go round and round instead of getting chopped. I'm going to chop these to the kind of general consistency I would expect to see if I bought chopped dates. So those also can now go into the bowl, and it's now starting to look like I should have perhaps chosen a bigger bowl. Mix thoroughly. Oh, I'm messing up here actually as well because we should be adding crushed pineapple. Again, I don't have crushed pineapple, I've got pineapple chunks because that's all I could buy. It doesn't say anything about draining it, but I'm assuming we drain off the syrup or juice. It's interesting, when you buy pineapple chunks, quite often now you get whole rings of pineapple and they've just obviously put them in as rings and then they've driven a cutter through them after they're packed in a can. So I'm just going to whiz that in the food processor. That seems to be about right. I've already messed up on the directions here, by the way, because it says to add the add nuts and dates. Stir and add to the mixture alternately with the pineapple. So I'm meant to add a bit of the dry ingredients and a bit of the pineapple and so on, but I am going to just hope for the best here. So if this works, we'll give credit to Gayelord Hauser. If it fails, we'll blame me. So I think if this doesn't come together, I might add a bit of the pineapple juice. Just make sure I've really thoroughly mixed it all the way down to the bottom. We don't end up with a cake that's only got fruit and nuts in one place. Okay. That seems to be pretty thoroughly mixed now. So now I just need to pick a loaf tin that looks about the right size for that. I reckon it could be that one. I'm only going to line the bottom and the two long sides of this just because it's so much easier to do that. I'll grease all 5 sides of the tin. That is sides including bottom. And then just with a strip of paper like that, we'll go in. So we've only really got the bottom and the 2 sides. So I don't know how much this is going to rise. It should rise a bit because it's got baking powder and baking soda in it. The baking powder is sufficient to rise all on its own. The baking soda should react with the pineapple to produce a bit of a rise. So just make sure it's pressed down properly into the corners, and then try to smooth it off at the top. It's quite a dense mixture. I wonder if it should have had the juice of the pineapple in there. It doesn't specify, but perhaps a can of crushed pineapple, the juice wouldn't be a kind of separate entity. Anyway, that's now going to go in the oven. It says 325 Fahrenheit, which is, by my calculation, about 165 Celsius. I'll turn it down to 160 because I've got a fan oven, for about 1 hour. Which is plenty of time to get everything wiped down and all of my cleaning up done. I'm going to check after 45 minutes because you can't unbake a cake. So we are about halfway through the initial bit of cooking, and the cake's risen quite nicely. It's got a slightly domed top, which looks great. I'm going to test it after the 45 minutes and then we'll see if it's cooked in the middle. If not, it'll go back in for the remainder, making up the full hour. While we're here though, if you're wondering what quick service cake means, share your curiosity. I have tried researching this and I can't find out what... Well, I assumed this was a quick version of something called service cake, but it's possible, I suppose, that it's a quick service cake, although it takes an hour to bake, so that seems unlikely. So I've no idea what quick service cake is, and I searched and all I found was things about how to serve cake. So if you happen to know what this might be, I would be very grateful if you'd let me know in the comments. Okay, that's had 45 minutes now. Let's just give it a test with a skewer into the kind of middle here. And it's coming out a little bit sticky. That might just be a bit of melted date though. But no, I think we'll put that back in and give it the remaining 15 minutes. Okay, further 15 minutes has elapsed. Let's see where we're at now. Still a little bit sticky. What to do? Yeah, I don't think we can bake that anymore. So I'm going to stop there. Just going to run a knife down the ends of the tin here, just to make sure those bits are free. Is it going to come out easy? Okay, so there we go. Quick service cake. And we're going to wait for that to cool before we try to slice it. Okay, well here it is. Still ever so slightly warm. But time for a taste test of Gayelord Hauser's quick service cake. So that's what it looks like inside. Nutty and chunks of fruit. So it's a nice crumbly cake. Pretty nice texture. It feels quite moist. Quite light considering it's a wholemeal cake. I assume the soya flour is partly the reason for that, but also there's quite a lot of leavening in this. It's a nice cake, very nutty, very pleasant texture, just the right level of sweetness, not overly sweet. That's a good cake. And because it's got all these nuts and stuff in it, it doesn't disappear quite as quickly as a slice of regular fruitcake would. I don't normally put nuts in fruitcake. If I try to be brutally critical of this, I think it could stand to have some more spice in there. Maybe some ginger and nutmeg as well as the cinnamon. I think that'd be nice. It's nice as it is, it's just the cinnamon's quite subtle. However, Gayelord Hauser's quick service cake is a really good cake. So I think the other thing we're going to make is this wild rice and almond pudding, because it just sounds delightfully strange. It's a rice pudding, but it's made with wild rice. It's got shredded wheat in it. It's got green peppers and onions in it as well. So super weird. Now what's interesting here is that Gayelord Hauser's definition of pudding appears to be more consistent with the English version of pudding and the British version of pudding than it is with the American version, even though he's a German living in America. This book was republished for the British Isles, so he wrote this book in, I think, 1946, and then this edition in 1955 was published in Great Britain. So perhaps there's been some accommodation for our terminology here. Pudding in the UK means just about anything. Here's my incomplete crib list of things that are called pudding in the land where I live. Perhaps the real pudding was inside of us all along. Anyway, we're going to try and make this wild rice and almond pudding. So the first thing I need is some cooked wild rice. And I hit a snag. Wild rice is really expensive to get where I live, and the only shop that had any only had this tiny bag. £2.99 for 125 grams of wild rice, which is not going to be enough for this recipe. So I bought what appeared to be the next best or next nearest thing, which is black pearl rice. I don't know if this is a proper equivalent, but it's the best I could do. Anyway, so I've got to make 2 cups of cooked rice. So I'm going to start off with, I think, 1 cup, and we'll cook this. They both need about the same amount of cooking, so I can cook these together. My research suggests that it's neither appropriate or necessary to wash these varieties of rice. And I was looking to see whether it's an absorption method or just something else, and it's something else. So basically we've got to just cook this in plenty of water, and then if there's any excess water at the end of the cooking time, then we just drain that off. Okay, that rice only took about 20 minutes to cook, and I must have judged the water just about right. There was hardly anything to drain off of that. I'm not even sure that I really needed to add that black pearl rice, because I think this has more than doubled in size. But yeah, we got nice cooked rice grains with just a little bit of bite to them. Let's just set that aside for a moment while we prepare the other ingredients. So we need seriously 3/8 of a cup. 3/8 of a cup of seedless raisins. It says put the raisins and nuts through the fine disc of the food mincer. I don't have a food mincer anymore. I use it for grinding recycled plastic. We're going to be using the food processor for chopping up most of these things. 1 1/4 cups of shelled almonds. Okay, well, we're getting somewhere. I might put the raisins in because I think that might give the blades a little bit more grip on those nuts. 3/8 of a cup. 1, 2, 3. Wow, that was a bit of an ordeal, but we got there in the end. So that lot's going to go in the mixing bowl, but we're not finished here. Right, it says 2/3 of a cup of minced onion, but for crying out loud, I'm just going to use this onion. I reckon that's about 2/3 of a cup once it's peeled. And we're supposed to have 1 large green pepper minced. I haven't got 1 large green pepper. This is my leisure pepper. That's the one from the upstairs greenhouse, which is green, mostly. This is the last one from the downstairs greenhouse, which is, yeah, it's starting to go red. Anyway, these 2 together I think will do, even though it's not the right colour and not the right size. That was a lot easier than the almonds. So that onion and pepper mix goes into our mixing bowl as well. So I think all illusions that this is anything like rice pudding should be starting to disappear at this point. At least it's not like a conventional English rice pudding. Now we do need 2 cups of the rice. 1, 2. A little bit of rice left over. I don't think I needed that black pearl rice, but I didn't know. Then we need a teaspoon of veggie salt. A 1/4 teaspoon of garlic seasoning. Unclear what he means by garlic seasoning, so I'm going to use garlic granules. I imagine garlic seasoning might be garlic salt, so perhaps we're going to be a bit low on the salt here, but I think we'll do. So that's a 1/2 teaspoon measure, so we want half of the 1/2 teaspoon measure. That's about right. It's clear from reading between the lines, actually, and explicitly he says at one point, he's not a big fan of garlic. So just stir those things together. Okay, got to find a dish that's going to be about the right size for this in a minute. Now we want a cup of cream. Again, not specific on the kind of cream, so I've assumed single cream, which is about 20% fat, 19% fat. Oh boy. And we stir that through. A half a cup of crumbled shredded wheat. So let's make a judgment here. I think a half a cup is going to be maybe 1.5 of these shredded wheat biscuits. Lightly mix in the shredded wheat crumbs. Okay, lightly mix. And then turn into a well-buttered baking dish, which I think is going to be this casserole dish. So now it doesn't say whether it should be covered when it's baked. A well-buttered baking dish, and in goes the mixture. Doesn't say to do this, but my inclination is to press that down. It seems very firm. I think this is going to dry out without a lid on it. I'm going to make a judgment call here. I'm putting a lid on this because it's got to go in a 350 Fahrenheit oven, which is 175 Celsius, for 30 to 40 minutes. I think without a lid, that's just going to dry out. So, lid on. Into the oven now. Okay, well, that's after 40 minutes of cooking. That smells nice. It smells quite savoury. So I don't know that this is actually really cooked together into a pudding, but then that doesn't really matter. Pudding can be anything, as we said earlier. I'm going to taste it a little bit now, but I suspect this is too hot to really properly enjoy. Okay. Surprisingly strange combination of flavours. The raisins and the green peppers and the garlic and the almonds. Just a really weird mishmash. Strangely got an almost meaty flavour to it from that combination of ingredients. I wonder if that's the protein in the almonds that's contributing to that. Anyway, I'm going to leave this to cool down just a little bit to make it... the recipe book doesn't say whether it's to be served hot or cold. So I'm going to let this cool down to kind of warm. We've got to make a sauce to go with it as well. The book says serve with a thick lemon sauce or a tart apple sauce. I thought maybe that those were going to be specific named recipes elsewhere in this book, but they don't appear to be. There is a recipe for an apple relish, which is basically just liquidized apples, so I'll probably make that and we'll serve that along with it. Now, whilst I did say there isn't a sour apple sauce or a tart apple sauce recipe in here, like he refers to in the rice pudding recipe, there are a couple of apple sauce recipes. There's this one here, 5-minute applesauce, which actually sounds quite nice. So it says melt some butter in a heavy pan as carefully as you would for scrambled eggs. When the butter is hot but still golden, not browned, throw in shredded unpeeled apples. Heat them through, turn them over once, and you'll have an applesauce fit for kings and gods. For additional flavour, add honey to taste. Well, I'll leave the honey out because we want a tart apple sauce. So I've got these lovely russet apples. It was given to us by some friends. I do love a russet apple. They've got such a lot of flavour in the skin. And since this recipe is about leaving the skin on, that is just about ideal. Okay, so I'm going to heat some butter, delightfully unspecific amount of butter, in a pan, as carefully as I would for scrambled eggs. So I'm just melting this butter at this point. So we'll just make sure we take it off the heat if it starts to sizzle. And then my apples, that's 2 of those small russet apples in there, grated with their skins on. And we are to cook that in the butter, turning over once. I'll just add a little dash of water, because these russet apples might be just a little bit drier than other types of apples. They are quite a firm apple. I am going to stir this now just to see what the texture is like. I don't think we're going to get a sauce, and I think that's just because these apples don't cook down to a pulp. So, I think we'll leave it there. Right then. So, a serving of Gayelord Hauser's almond and wild rice pudding with applesauce for gods and kings. Time to give this a proper taste. Okay, well, I think first the pudding on its own, now that it's cooled down. Now it has set into more of a cake-like consistency. So I suppose pudding in the sense of maybe Christmas pudding or something like that. It's very unusual, kind of weird mixture of sweet and savoury. So together with the applesauce, also very good. Now this recipe for this pudding would be probably quite easy to veganise, because the only, I think, non-vegan ingredient in there was the cream. So you could probably use tofu or soya cream or something like that. Now this is supposed to be a breakfast thing. Would I want this for breakfast? I feel like maybe this could be a breakfast treat for some kind of occasion. You know, it feels like something that maybe people would traditionally eat for Easter breakfast or something like that. I just get the sense of this being maybe a special occasion type of breakfast pudding thing. Now, of course, I'm not any kind of a fussy eater, really, so take that into consideration. But yeah, that's just really nice. And actually, despite the fact this has onions and peppers and things in it, it's not a weird contrast of sweet and savoury. It's actually quite a complementary one. So it's sweet, it's savoury, it's nutty, it's got some interesting texture. It's got an interesting savoury, meaty vibe to it, which I think is probably coming from the almonds, but it's also just because it's a bit like a coarse sausage meat texture. That's really rather good. And I suppose that's a good thing because there's plenty of it. As soon as this is completely cold, I'll chill it down. I'll have some for breakfast tomorrow probably as well. And I might even freeze some. I imagine this will freeze quite well. A strange and interesting dish. So to conclude the review of this vintage cookbook, it's been quite a refreshing and surprising experience. I think you do have to be able to filter out the pseudoscientific dietary nonsense that's in here. But there are some interesting recipes in here, and a lot of them are really good. The alkaline diet that he's promoting is accidentally okay. So that was my review of the Gayelord Hauser Cookbook, 1955. I hope this has been interesting. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you again soon.